Hello friends and welcome back. Tonight, we're stepping into one of the darkest and most mysterious chapters of history, the Spanish Inquisition. This is a story of faith and fear, of power and persecution, and of how belief itself became a weapon. So get comfortable, dim the lights, and let the weight of the past carry you gently into sleep as we journey together through the long shadow of the Inquisition. Please give the video a like and subscribe if you enjoy watching. Tell me what you think about the video in the comment section. In the final years of the Middle Ages, Spain was a land of shifting light and shadow. Across the Iberian Peninsula, one could hear the bells of cathedrals clashing with the call to prayer from minarets, while Hebrew chants lingered in hidden quarters. For centuries, Muslims, Jews and Christians had lived in uneasy coexistence, trading goods, ideas, and occasionally blows. This convivencia was fragile but real, producing golden ages of poetry in Córdoba and brilliant scholarship in Toledo. Yet by the mid-15th century, this delicate balance was crumbling. Suspicion stalked the streets, and beneath the hum of daily life, a darker mood was taking hold. Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, united in both marriage and ambition, envisioned a Spain cleansed of division. To them, religion was not only belief but a tool of nation-building. Their court glittered with wealth and ceremony, yet beneath the silks and jewels, whispers of fear spread among subjects who did not fit the mould of Catholic purity. The monarchs saw themselves as champions of Christendom, chosen to finish the Reconquista and carry Spain into greatness. But that greatness demanded unity, and unity demanded conformity. It was in their reign that seeds of an institution were sown, an institution that would become infamous throughout history. In the small towns of Castile, fear trickled through narrow cobbled alleys like smoke. Neighbours watched one another with darting eyes. Did that family light candles on Friday night, a Jewish custom? Did that merchant mutter prayers in Arabic under his breath? Even the smallest slip could spark a whisper, and a whisper could grow into an accusation. The pressure was most severe on conversos, Jews who had converted to Christianity, sometimes by choice, often by force. Outwardly, they attended Mass, baptized their children, and crossed themselves. But suspicion lingered. Were they Christians at heart, or were their souls still tied to the faith of their ancestors? Religion in Spain was not just a matter of faith. It was the bedrock of life itself. To be outside the church was to be outside the community. The Mass marked the rhythm of the week, saints' feast days punctuated the year, and the churchyard was where families gathered to bury their dead. The church's rituals promised salvation, but they also bound people in fear. Hell was no metaphor. Eternal flames, demons tearing at souls, everlasting torment, these were painted vividly in stained glass and carved into stone. To doubt, to question, or to stray was not merely dangerous, it was unthinkable. It was within this world of devotion and dread that the idea of an inquisition took hold. Ferdinand and Isabella sought not only political unity, but spiritual uniformity. They petitioned the Pope for the right to establish a uniquely Spanish tribunal to root out heresy. In 1478, permission was granted. Unlike earlier inquisitions in France or Italy, this would be under the control of the crown, not merely the church. It was a blending of altar and throne, of mitre and crown. Few yet understood what it would mean, but a shadow had fallen across Spain, one that would only grow darker. The first flames of fear burned in Seville. In 1481, the Inquisition held its earliest trials there. A handful of conversos were accused of secretly practicing Judaism. Their names were whispered across the city, and when they were paraded through the streets, barefoot and bound, the crowds murmured with both pity and satisfaction. Some were forced into public penance, others burned at the stake in spectacles that blended ritual with terror. The message was clear. Spain would have one faith, and those who strayed would face consequences beyond imagination. From Seville, the fire spread outward, reaching city after city. Ordinary people began to live in quiet dread. A servant who repeated her mistress's words could doom a household. A jealous rival might denounce a competitor. The anonymity of accusations gave power to the bitter and the fearful alike. Once accused, a person entered a system designed less for justice than for confession. The trials were secret, evidence withheld, defence impossible. Families lived in uncertainty, never knowing when a knock on the door might come. The silence of a neighbour was a blessing, their curiosity a danger. As word of the Inquisition's power spread, the atmosphere of Spain shifted entirely. Public squares that had once hosted festivals now echoed with the sombre processions of accused heretics. Inquisitors in heavy black robes, their faces grave, carried the authority of both God and king. Behind them trailed lines of prisoners, each wearing the San Benito, a yellow robe painted with crosses or flames, a garment of shame. For the accused, it was the end of hope. For the spectators, it was a lesson in obedience. Fear became a constant companion, binding the people tighter than chains. And yet, amidst all this, life carried on. Merchants still haggled in the markets, children played in the dusty streets, farmers drove their oxen across the fields. The sun still set behind the Sierra Nevada in a blaze of crimson, and sailors still dreamed of horizons beyond the sea. But beneath every gesture, every smile, was the awareness that someone was always watching. Faith gave comfort, but it also demanded conformity. And in this Spain of flickering candles and heavy shadows, the Inquisition had found fertile ground to grow. Thus began the shadowed age of faith and fear. The Inquisition was not merely an institution, it was a mindset. It was the neighbour's whisper, the priest's raised brow, the monarch's decree. It was the weight of silence that pressed on every tongue. Spain was entering a new era, one where faith would be used to bind, control and terrify. What had once been convivencia was gone. What remained was a land preparing to sacrifice its diversity for the illusion of unity. The shadows lengthened, and Spain stepped into one of its darkest chapters. In 15th century Spain, faith was not a private matter hidden in the heart. It was a language spoken in every street, a rhythm that ordered the hours of each day. The peasant in the field paused to cross himself when the bells tolled noon. Merchants in busy plazas swore oaths on the Virgin's name when striking deals. Kings and nobles wrapped their rule in sacred symbols, knowing that the people trusted a ruler who carried God's blessing. Faith was the glue of Spanish society, but it was also a sharp blade, ready to cut down those who stood apart. From pulpits across Castile and Aragon, priests thundered warnings about the dangers of heresy. Eternal damnation was not abstract. It was painted on church walls in lurid reds and blacks. Demons devoured the sinful. Flames licked the bodies of the damned. Children were raised to believe that even the smallest deviation from the sacraments could condemn a soul forever. In this climate, to question was dangerous, and to resist was unthinkable. Religion offered comfort and community, but it also chained minds with visions of fire and punishment. Ferdinand and Isabella understood the power of this fear. In their view, Spain's destiny depended not only on winning wars, but also on shaping belief. They framed their rule as divinely chosen, their marriage blessed by heaven, their military victories ordained by God. Their speeches were filled with sacred imagery, and their policies took aim at those who resisted Catholic unity. For them, faith was not only devotion, it was policy. And in policy, faith became a weapon, sharpened against those who lived differently. The first to feel this weapon's edge were the conversos, families who had accepted baptism but whose bloodlines carried Jewish ancestry. Centuries of resentment boiled against them. They held positions as physicians, bankers, and royal advisors, which bred both envy and suspicion. Commoners whispered that their conversions were false, that behind closed shutters they recited Hebrew prayers or slaughtered lambs in secret. To accuse a converso was to win favour, and to expose one was to cleanse the community. Even before the Inquisition's machinery began to turn, the air crackled with suspicion. Muslims too stood under the monarch's gaze. Though Granada still resisted, the momentum of the Reconquista was against them. Across Castile, laws restricted Muslims from bearing arms, riding horses, or openly practicing their faith. Villages that once rang with the sound of Arabic poetry now fell silent under the weight of Christian watchfulness. Even converts, the Moriscos, were marked by suspicion. To Spanish rulers, difference was always dangerous, and faith became the measure of loyalty. The pulpit and the crown worked together seamlessly. Priests urged obedience, declaring rebellion not only a crime against the monarch, but also a sin against God. Nobles marched into war with banners bearing the Virgin Mary's image, convinced they carried heaven's will onto the battlefield. The fusion of faith and power made resistance nearly impossible. To doubt a king was to doubt the church. To doubt the church was to risk damnation. The two institutions intertwined, reinforcing one another with every decree, every sermon, every prayer. Ordinary Spaniards absorbed this atmosphere deeply. Faith guided not only how they prayed, but how they ate, how they dressed, how they celebrated, even how they thought. A loaf of bread was never broken without crossing it first. Festivals honoured saints rather than seasons. Children were named after martyrs, and their lullabies carried warnings of devils waiting to snatch the careless. The church bell was a compass, telling the farmer when to sow and the merchant when to pack his stall. To live outside this faith was to live outside Spain itself. But faith could also divide. It was not simply a matter of shared belief, but of shared conformity. Anyone who resisted risked being branded as untrustworthy. Jews who had lived for centuries in walled barrios now felt the walls closing tighter. Muslims saw their traditions ridiculed as foreign, even barbaric. And Christians who dared question the authority of Rome were warned of heresy. Faith that had once inspired poetry and learning was now hardened into an iron cage, locking Spain into a singular path. For Ferdinand and Isabella, this tightening was necessary. The union of their kingdoms demanded more than political treaties. It required a shared spirit, a single unbroken creed. They believed Spain could not rise to greatness while torn by religious diversity. In their vision, the crown's strength and the church's purity were one and the same. And so the tools of faith, ritual, scripture, sermon, became weapons wielded against their own people. The people of Spain soon learned to live within this weaponized faith. They attended processions not merely out of devotion, but out of necessity, ensuring their neighbours saw their piety. They crossed themselves in public with exaggerated gestures, lest anyone doubt their sincerity. Silence in the marketplace could be dangerous. The wrong words in conversation could ruin a life. And as the 1470s drew to a close, the fear that had lingered in whispers was about to find form in a tribunal that would bind Spain in iron shadows, the Inquisition itself. The year was 1478, and Spain stood at a crossroads. The Reconquista was nearly won, Granada teetered, and Ferdinand and Isabella looked upon their kingdom with both pride and unease. Victory seemed within reach, yet unity felt fragile. Conversos were accused of clinging to old rites, Muslims resisted assimilation, and whispers of doubt lingered in cathedral shadows. The monarchs believed they had been chosen by God to defend the faith, and so they petitioned Pope Sixtus IV for a weapon unlike any Spain had ever known, a tribunal to purge heresy not in Rome's name but in theirs. The papal bull authorized a Spanish Inquisition under royal control. For centuries, inquisitors had existed elsewhere in Europe, pursuing heresy in France and Italy. But never before had the tribunal been placed so firmly in the hands of monarchs. With this document, Ferdinand and Isabella gained the power to root out dissent, not just as a matter of faith, but as a matter of state. The church lent them authority, but the crown wielded the sword. Spain's Inquisition was born not as a purely spiritual court, but as a fusion of altar and throne. Seville became the cradle of this new tribunal. In 1481, the first inquisitors arrived, armed with authority that terrified even the nobility. Their black robes distinguished them from priests, their words carried the weight of both king and pope, and their presence announced a new age. Soon the city's streets echoed with rumours. Lists of suspects began to circulate. Ordinary people, once neighbours and friends, now looked at one another with suspicion. By year's end, dozens of conversos had been arrested, interrogated and condemned. The shadow had materialized into something terrifyingly real. The accused were taken to dark stone prisons, places of silence broken only by chains and whispered prayers. Few ever saw their charges, fewer still saw their accusers. Trials unfolded in secrecy. The accused might be held for weeks or months before interrogation began, their fate already sealed by rumour. Families pleaded in vain, bribes disappeared into greedy hands, and neighbours learned to keep their mouths shut. To be summoned before the tribunal was almost a sentence in itself, for acquittals were rare, and forgiveness came only with humiliating penance. One of the earlier spectacles came in the form of executions. In January of 1481, 6 conversos were burned alive in Seville. The flames lit up the night, reflecting in the faces of thousands who had gathered to watch. Priests preached of salvation, declaring that the condemned souls might yet be saved through fire. To the people, it was both horror and theatre, punishment dressed as piety. The spectacle sent a message across Spain. The Inquisition was not a rumour, but a force. The crown was pleased. The Inquisition proved a powerful tool not only for faith but also for politics. Wealth seized from the accused flowed into royal coffers, funding wars and courtly splendour. Fear ensured obedience, silencing opposition before it could take root. Even nobles, once untouchable, realised that their bloodlines and reputations could not shield them from suspicion. The tribunal was more than a religious court. It was an engine of control, tightening Ferdinand and Isabella's grip on a land that trembled before their authority. Panic spread quickly through Spain's Jewish communities. Centuries of coexistence had already frayed under riots and pogroms. Now, with the Inquisition targeting conversos, fear ran like wildfire. Families debated in secret. Should they flee? Should they convert? Should they cling to faith in defiance? The streets of Toledo and Cordoba hummed with anxious whispers. Even those who had converted lived under suspicion, their every gesture, their every meal, their every holiday watched by suspicious eyes. No matter what they did, they were never truly safe. The Inquisition's reputation grew beyond Spain's borders. Travellers carried stories of secret prisons and burning stakes to France, Italy and beyond. Some exaggerated, others understated, but all agreed on one thing. Spain had unleashed something both unique and terrifying. Foreign courts whispered of cruelty cloaked in piety, and pamphlets spread dark tales of inquisitors hunting heresy with merciless zeal. Spain was crafting not only an institution but a legend, one that would haunt Europe's imagination for centuries. For the common Spaniard, the Inquisition was both distant and near. Few ever faced trial, yet everyone felt its shadow. Attending Mass was no longer just devotion. It was survival. A missed confession might spark questions. A careless phrase could be twisted into heresy. Even laughter at the wrong moment could draw suspicion. The Inquisition was not only about the few who were burned, it was about the many who lived in fear of being next. Fear became the true fuel of the tribunal, spreading faster than fire ever could. Thus, with fire, prison, and rumour, the Spanish Inquisition was born. It emerged not suddenly, but steadily, growing stronger with each trial and each execution. Ferdinand and Isabella had built a machine that served both their faith and their throne. It would expand, evolve, and darken further in the years to come, but even in its infancy, it had already reshaped Spain. From Seville to Toledo, from court to countryside, the message was unmistakable. Spain would be united, and faith would be its weapon. The shadow had taken form, and it was only the beginning. In 1483, the Spanish Inquisition found its most infamous figure, Tomás de Torquemada. Born in Valladolid, a Dominican friar steeped in austere devotion, he believed utterly in the purity of the faith. To him, heresy was not simply error, it was poison, seeping silently into the soul of the nation. His face was thin, his frame lean, his eyes sharp as blades. Clad in the black robes of his order, Torquemada was less a man than a symbol, the embodiment of ruthless devotion. When Ferdinand and Isabella named him the first Grand Inquisitor, the Inquisition gained not only structure, but a face that would terrify generations. Torquemada organised the Inquisition with relentless discipline. He appointed inquisitors across Spain, issued manuals for procedure, and built a network of courts that reached into nearly every corner of the kingdom. Nothing escaped his gaze. He demanded uniformity, insisting that all tribunals follow strict codes of secrecy, interrogation, and punishment. To the monarchs, he was invaluable, a man who would defend their vision of unity with tireless resolve. To the people, he became the whispered terror in every marketplace, the faceless judge behind every closed door. He was relentless against conversos. In Torquemada's eyes, many had converted only to escape persecution, and their hidden rituals threatened the soul of Spain. He unleashed waves of investigations, gathering testimony from informants, prying into homes and demanding endless confessions. Fear spread like wildfire. Families accused of secretly lighting Sabbath candles or avoiding pork were dragged into tribunals. Even the smallest ritual gesture, once harmless, could be twisted into a sign of disloyalty. Torquemada's message was clear. There could be no half-faith, no private conscience, only absolute conformity. The Grand Inquisitor also saw symbolism as a weapon. He introduced the San Benito, the penitential robe marked with crosses, flames, or demons, which shamed the accused even before punishment was delivered. Wearing it meant humiliation, a walking proclamation of guilt. Citizens who saw one knew instantly that the wearer was marked. These garments were hung in churches after the accused were punished, a permanent reminder of treachery and divine justice. To Torquemada, this public spectacle was as important as the trials themselves, for fear did not spread only through fire, but through memory. His severity was matched only by his austerity. Torquemada lived simply, eating plain meals, sleeping little, and spending long hours in prayer. He believed that his harshness was not cruelty, but duty, that by purging heresy, he was saving souls from eternal damnation. To him, the stake was not a place of destruction, but of purification, a last chance for redemption through fire. This conviction made him both terrifying and unyielding. For Torquemada, mercy was weakness, and weakness was sin. Between 1483 and 1498, during Torquemada's tenure, thousands were tried, and many perished in flames. Numbers varied, some chroniclers exaggerated, others minimized, but the impact was undeniable. Families were broken, communities destroyed, entire cultures silenced. Torquemada's name became synonymous with fear. Even nobles, once untouchable, found themselves dragged into the system. His tribunal did not respect wealth or lineage. Only faith, pure and unquestioning, could stand as defense. And even then, suspicion lingered like smoke. Yet not all despised him. To devout Catholics, Torquemada was a guardian of the faith, a man chosen by God to protect Spain from corruption. Monks and priests praised his zeal. The monarchs defended him, even as foreign courts muttered against his cruelty. To them, he was the bulwark that ensured Spain's divine mission would not be poisoned by dissent. His reputation split the world in two. Saint to some, tyrant to others, always a figure cloaked in shadow. Legends soon wrapped around his name. Tales told of him appearing in two places at once, of his gaze alone breaking a prisoner's resolve, of fires that burned brighter under his command. Whether true or false, these stories magnified his presence. He was no longer merely a man, but a myth, whispered of in kitchens, taverns, and cloisters alike. To the poor peasant, Torquemada was a figure both distant and intimate, distant in power, intimate in fear. Even within Spain, voices rose in quiet protest. Some nobles feared the Inquisition's growing power. Scholars worried that suspicion stifled learning. Merchants saw trade falter as converso families fled or hid their wealth, but none dared openly oppose the Grand Inquisitor. His influence reached into every corner of the kingdom, and the monarchs shielded him with their authority. Opposition melted away under the weight of fire and fear. By the time Torquemada died in 1498, his legacy was secure. Spain was reshaped in his image, a land bound by fear, obedience, and the illusion of religious unity. The fires he lit did not die with him. Instead, they spread, carried on by those who inherited his office and his zeal. His name would echo through centuries as the very symbol of cruelty cloaked in righteousness. Spain had found its Grand Inquisitor, and through him the Inquisition became legend. To face the Inquisition was to step into a world where guilt was assumed, innocence unthinkable, and silence as damning as words. The process began with a whisper, an accusation scrawled anonymously and slipped into the hands of inquisitors. The accused might have no idea who betrayed them, a jealous neighbour, a rival merchant, or even a family member seeking favour. Once the name was spoken, there was no turning back. The tribunal would summon the suspect, and from that moment, life unravelled like thread from a fraying cloth. The summons carried with it dread. To be called before the tribunal meant days, weeks, or even months of waiting in a cold cell, wondering what evidence had been gathered, what witnesses had spoken, and what fate awaited. Families wept in silence, neighbours distanced themselves, and reputations shattered overnight. Prisoners were stripped of weapons, possessions, and dignity. In some cases, their property was seized before the trial even began, a grim signal to the community that guilt was already assumed. The trial itself was unlike any other in Europe. There was no defense lawyer, no open court, no confrontation with accusers. The tribunal sat in silence, its black-robed judges watching every movement, every hesitation. Accusations were read aloud, but the names of informants were withheld. To the accused, it was like fighting a shadow. They could not strike back because they could not see what struck them. Suspicion alone was enough to stain, and a slip of the tongue could doom them. Confession was the tribunal's goal. To achieve it, they used patience, intimidation, and when all else failed, torture. Torture was not applied recklessly but ritualistically, as if suffering could cleanse both the soul and the truth. Prisoners might be stretched on the rack until their joints cracked, suspended by their wrists in the strappado, or forced to endure the terror of water torture, lungs burning as if drowning. Pain was inflicted with solemn precision, accompanied by priests urging the victim to confess and save their soul. For many, the pressure broke long before the instruments of pain were wheeled out. Weeks in silence, isolation, and the weight of uncertainty were enough to shatter resolve. Prisoners confessed to anything, secret rituals they never performed, words they never spoke, even plots they never imagined. Confessions were sometimes wild and contradictory, yet they served the tribunal's purpose. The Inquisition was not searching for truth, but for affirmation of its authority. Once the words were spoken, the machinery of judgment turned. Punishments varied. Some were forced to wear the San Benito and march through the streets in public humiliation, confessing their sins before the jeering crowd. Others endured whippings, exile, or imprisonment. For the unlucky, the sentence was death. The condemned were handed over to secular authorities, for the Church claimed it did not shed blood. Yet everyone knew the meaning of that phrase. The stake awaited. The tribunal washed its hands, declaring that the soul had been offered one last chance. The body, however, was consumed in fire. The most feared events were the auto da fe, the acts of faith. These were public rituals where sentences were pronounced, punishments carried out, and executions staged. Entire cities turned out to witness them. Streets were lined with banners, nobles sat on raised platforms, and priests intoned solemn prayers. The accused, in their San Benitos, stood before the crowd like actors in a grim theatre. For some, it was penance and reconciliation. For others, it was fire. To the onlookers, it was both a warning and a spectacle, faith on display, fear in action. Children watched wide-eyed as flames rose, imprinting images that would haunt them for life. Merchants closed their stalls to attend. Farmers travelled miles to witness the spectacle. Some wept, others cheered. Many prayed that their own lives would never be caught in such a blaze. The fire's glow reached beyond the condemned. It illuminated the power of the Inquisition. It said, in language no one could mistake, heresy will be burned out root and branch from the soil of Spain. Yet beneath the spectacle lay deep scars. Families of the accused lived with shame for generations. Names were recorded in church registers, forever marked by suspicion. Even those who escaped death carried the weight of humiliation. Neighbours never forgot, opportunities vanished, and whispers followed their children. The Inquisition punished not just the individual, but the lineage, weaving fear into the very fabric of society. To be touched by its judgment was to carry a brand invisible yet inescapable. The trials of faith were never truly about faith alone. They were about control, control of belief, control of behaviour, control of entire communities. By weaving religion into the machinery of law, Ferdinand, Isabella, and their inquisitors ensured that loyalty was no longer optional. It was demanded, inspected, and enforced. Spain had entered an age where salvation and obedience were indistinguishable, where the soul itself was subject to the crown. The Inquisition had perfected its system of trials, and with it, a kingdom trembled. The word Inquisition summoned terror not only because of trials and judgments, but because of the whispered knowledge of what happened in hidden chambers. Behind heavy oak doors and beneath vaulted stone ceilings, tools were prepared to break the body and bend the will. The Inquisitors called it the question, a ritual of persuasion meant to pry open the lips of the accused. To the victim, it was agony masked as salvation. To the crowd who never saw it directly, it was myth and rumour. And in rumour, fear flourished. The most notorious device was the rack. The accused would be stretched upon it, wrists and ankles bound to rollers that turned slowly, pulling joints from sockets with each deliberate twist. Screams echoed off the walls as bones cracked, sinews tore, and breath came in ragged gasps. The inquisitors recorded confessions in neat script while assistants tightened ropes. Each movement of the wheel was both a question and an answer, for pain loosened tongues faster than mercy. Another method was the strappado, deceptively simple yet devastating. The victim's hands were bound behind their back, a rope tied to their wrists, and then hoisted upward. Their body dangled, weight pulling mercilessly on dislocated shoulders, sometimes dropped suddenly before being yanked back up. The body's own weight became the tormentor. For hours, sometimes days, the condemned swung like broken marionettes, confessing whatever was demanded simply to be lowered. The water torment was perhaps the most insidious. Victims were bound and cloth stuffed into their mouths, then water poured until they choked and gasped, lungs screaming for air. The sensation was drowning without death, each breath a desperate battle. To the inquisitors it was not cruelty but persuasion, a gentle means to unlock the soul. Survivors often confessed anything asked of them, not for fear of fire but for one more breath of air. Not all instruments drew blood. Some were designed to exhaust the body and mind. Prisoners were kept in perpetual darkness, chained to cold stone, fed only scraps. Silence gnawed at them until madness whispered in their ears. Others endured the torment of sleep deprivation, jolted awake with shouts, bells or blows until the mind broke from exhaustion. These invisible tortures left no scars for the crowd to see, but they were no less effective in extracting words, true or false. Yet the Inquisition maintained that torture was never punishment but correction. It was performed under ritual, recorded in official documents, and overseen by priests who urged the victim to repent. Inquisitors claimed they sought not death but salvation. That confession opened the door to forgiveness. The paradox was cruel. Suffering was painted as mercy, pain as a path to God. Those who endured the chamber often emerged not only broken but convinced that their tormentors acted with divine authority. The whispers of these instruments spread faster than the trials themselves. Few Spaniards ever saw the inside of a torture chamber, yet all knew its horrors. Children were warned to obey lest the inquisitors come. Merchants whispered of men who entered the tribunal with firm hearts and left limping, hollow-eyed, and silent. Fear did not require evidence, only imagination. And imagination filled the gaps, making the Inquisition larger, darker, and more omnipotent than reality alone could sustain. Foreigners, too, carried tales abroad. In France, England, and the Low Countries, pamphlets described monstrous devices of iron and flame. Some inventions were exaggerated, others wholly fabricated, but all served to spread Spain's reputation as a land of cruelty cloaked in faith. This black legend would haunt Spain's image for centuries, its inquisitors painted as devils in human form. Truth mattered little. What mattered was fear, and fear made Spain's enemies stronger even as it bound Spain's people tighter. The instruments of fear served not only to break individuals but to bind society. Few wanted to test the line between orthodoxy and heresy. Better to nod in agreement, to cross oneself publicly, to denounce a neighbour if needed. The chamber became a ghostly presence in daily life. It was never seen, but always felt. The rack and the strappado were not merely tools, they were symbols of what awaited anyone who strayed from the narrow path of conformity. In the end, the Inquisition's instruments of fear reshaped Spain without ever needing to be used on most of its people. The mere knowledge, or rumour, that they existed was enough. Families raised children to obedience, communities enforced conformity, and whispers of dissent died in throats. The rack, the strappado, the water, the silence. They were more than devices. They were weapons of the mind, forging a kingdom where faith was indistinguishable from fear. And in that fusion Spain was bound tighter than iron chains. The word itself meant act of faith, but for those who lived in Spain under the Inquisition, the auto da fe was more than a ritual. It was theatre, sermon, and execution rolled into one. These ceremonies brought the private fear of interrogation into the blazing light of the public square. They were designed to terrify and to teach, to remind the faithful that heresy was not only forbidden, but fatal. The auto da fe was the Inquisition's most visible weapon, and its flames licked the soul of the nation. Preparations began days in advance. Streets were swept, banners hung, and platforms built. Nobles received invitations, priests rehearsed sermons, and merchants sold food and trinkets to the swelling crowds. The air buzzed with anticipation, for the auto-da-fe was as much a festival as a punishment. Families travelled from miles away. Children perched on shoulders to catch a glimpse. It was a holy spectacle, staged with the precision of a royal procession, except that the stars of the show were the condemned. The condemned appeared at dawn, wearing the dreaded San Benito. Some robes bore crosses marking repentance. Others bore flames, demons, or serpents, branding the wearer as unrepentant and doomed. Heads were shaved, feet bare, hands bound. Their faces told a spectrum of human response: defiance, resignation, terror. They were paraded through the streets, so all could see the wages of heresy. For some spectators, it was a cautionary tale. For others, it was a guilty thrill, a chance to peer into the abyss without falling in. On the day itself, the plaza transformed into a stage. Nobles sat on raised platforms draped with rich fabrics. Priests stood ready to preach, crucifixes gleaming in the sunlight. Inquisitors in their sombre black robes held centre stage, commanding silence with their mere presence. Trumpets sounded, the crowd hushed, and the condemned were lined up before the tribunal. The atmosphere was thick with incense, heat, and expectation. This was no ordinary trial, it was a performance for the soul of Spain. Sermons thundered across the square, reminding all of the eternal dangers of sin. The accused were called forward one by one, their crimes announced to the crowd. Some confessed and begged forgiveness. Others denied to the end, voices trembling but unbroken. Each declaration was met with murmurs, gasps, or prayers from the watching masses. The ritual was designed to show that heresy could not be hidden, that faith saw all and punished all. The plaza became a pulpit, and fear was the gospel. For the penitent, sentences ranged from fines to pilgrimages to public whippings. They were reconciled with the church, though never fully free from stigma. For the unrepentant, however, the ritual ended with fire. The condemned were handed to secular authorities with solemn words, "The church does not shed blood." Yet everyone knew what those words meant. Guards led the doomed to stakes piled high with wood, while the crowd shifted from prayer to dread. Children craned their necks, adults whispered prayers, and the accused took their final steps. The executions were timed to strike maximum impact. As flames rose, priests shouted prayers of salvation, urging the condemned to repent even in their final breaths. Some screamed, some sang, some went silently into the fire. The crowd gasped, wailed, or crossed themselves fervently. The fire consumed more than bodies. It consumed doubt, driving home the lesson that heresy meant death. Spain itself seemed to shudder in the glow, as if the flames lit not only wood but the conscience of an entire people. For children, the auto-da-fe was a terrifying education. They learned early that faith was not only a matter of prayer, but of survival. Parents whispered warnings: attend mass, obey the priests, never question. The memory of fire lingered long after the smoke cleared. Merchants returned to their stalls, farmers to their fields, but the image of burning heretics haunted every conversation. Even those who believed the Inquisition cruel dared not speak it aloud. Silence was safer, obedience was life. Yet to the monarchs, the auto-da-fe was triumph. It reinforced their authority, pleased their allies, and filled their treasuries with confiscated wealth. It was unity through fear, spectacle dressed as devotion. The church proclaimed victory over heresy, the crown proclaimed loyalty to God, and the people proclaimed their obedience through silence. Spain glowed not only with fire but with the illusion of purity. Beneath that glow, diversity withered. When the last embers died and the plaza emptied, the memory of the day remained. San Benitos hung in churches, reminders of those condemned. Sermons recalled the flames for years after. Families whispered the names of the lost only behind closed doors. The auto-da-fe was more than an event, it was a scar carved into the soul of Spain. Faith and fear had been bound together, and the people learned to walk that narrow line, knowing the stake waited just beyond. In the spring of 1492, as Spain celebrated the fall of Granada, another decree was issued, one that would change the fate of thousands forever. Ferdinand and Isabella, emboldened by victory, declared that all Jews who refused baptism must leave Spain. Centuries of life, trade, learning, and community were swept aside with a stroke of a quill. Families who had lived on Iberian soil since Roman times were suddenly branded as outsiders, their presence a threat to the purity the monarchs demanded. It was a triumph for the crown, but a tragedy for its people. The decree gave Jews 4 months to decide: convert to Christianity or abandon everything they had built. Homes, shops, farms, libraries, all were to be left behind. Some sold what they could for pennies, cheated by opportunists who smelled desperation. Others buried treasures, hoping one day to return. Many refused to convert, choosing exile over betrayal of faith. The roads of Spain soon filled with weary caravans, families trudging under the sun, carts piled high with whatever belongings they could carry. Scenes of heartbreak unfolded in every city. In Toledo, synagogues that had stood for generations fell silent. In Seville, merchants who once thrived in the markets were gone overnight. In Barcelona, scholars left libraries of manuscripts behind, texts later lost to fire, neglect, or greed. The very lifeblood of Spain's cultural and economic life drained away. Yet in the plazas, priests preached that it was God's will, that Spain must be one faith, one people, one nation under heaven's gaze. Conversion was not always a salvation. Many Jews chose baptism, not from belief, but from desperation. They became new Christians, yet suspicion clung to them like a stain. Neighbours watched for signs of backsliding, lighting Sabbath candles, eating kosher, reciting forbidden prayers. For these conversos, the expulsion solved nothing. The Inquisition's gaze only grew sharper. They had exchanged exile for scrutiny, and their lives became performances of piety, every gesture weighed and judged. For those who chose exile, the journey was cruel. Ships overloaded with families set sail from ports like Valencia and Cadiz, their decks crowded with the desperate. Many were robbed by captains who threw passengers ashore in foreign lands with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Others perished from hunger, thirst, or storm. Some made it to North Africa, others to Italy, Portugal, or the Ottoman Empire, where Sultan Bayezid II welcomed them, remarking that Ferdinand and Isabella had impoverished their own land while enriching his. Spain itself paid a price. Its banking networks faltered, trade diminished, and skilled artisans vanished overnight. Cities lost physicians, scholars, and poets. The golden thread of diversity that had once woven through Iberian culture unravelled, leaving a fabric more rigid, less vibrant. The monarchs claimed victory for faith, but beneath the surface Spain's foundations were weakened. The loss was not only human but intellectual, cultural, and economic, a wound that would never fully heal. Families who left often carried only memory. Songs sung at dusk, recipes passed down, prayers whispered in secret, all became heirlooms of exile. In foreign lands, Spanish Jews, Sephardim, kept their traditions alive, speaking Ladino, a language that carried echoes of Spain long after Spain itself rejected them. Their diaspora stretched across the Mediterranean to Salonika, Constantinople, and beyond, each community a fragment of what once was, each heart still haunted by the soil of Castile and Aragon. For those left behind, the silence was deafening. Empty houses stood like tombs, synagogues stripped and converted into churches, Jewish quarters dissolved into shadows. The rhythm of life was altered permanently. Where once 3 faiths mingled uneasily, now only one was permitted. Spain was becoming a monoculture, its richness narrowed, its voices muted. The expulsion was not merely a decree, it was an erasure. The year 1492 is remembered for Columbus's voyage, for conquest and discovery. Yet for those who were expelled, it was remembered as a year of endings. While Spain launched itself toward empire, it cast out its own people, severing ties that had endured for centuries. For the exiles, 1492 was not the dawn of glory but the dusk of belonging. In their stories, the year was written not in triumph, but in tears. The expulsion of the Jews was both a moment and a message. It declared that Spain's future would be built on exclusion, that unity meant uniformity, and that fear would govern faith. For centuries, Jewish communities had been part of Spain's soul. In 1492, that soul was torn apart. The embers of convivencia, already fading, were finally extinguished. The Inquisition had found its ultimate weapon, not only punishing heresy but banishing entire peoples. When the banners of Castile and Aragon rose above the Alhambra in January 1492, Spain celebrated the fall of Granada, the last Muslim kingdom on Iberian soil. For centuries, Islamic rule had brought poetry, science and architecture that dazzled the world. Now the crescent moon was lowered and the cross was raised. At first, promises were made. Muslims could keep their faith, their mosques, their traditions. But promises made in victory rarely endure. Within a few short years, the shadow of the Inquisition stretched over the Muslims of Spain. Granada's capitulation treaty had guaranteed religious freedom. Mosques continued to echo with prayer, and Islamic courts still judged disputes. Yet tolerance proved fleeting. Priests soon pushed for conversion, arguing that true unity required one faith. Pressure mounted quietly at first. Restrictions on dress, bans on public prayer, limits on Arabic in schools. What began as gentle persuasion soon hardened into coercion. The fragile coexistence unravelled as suspicion grew that Muslims, like Jews before them, could never be trusted as true Spaniards. By the turn of the 16th century, forced conversions swept across Granada. Those who resisted were branded defiant, their mosques closed, their lands seized. The Moriscos, Muslims who accepted baptism, outwardly became Christians but clung to old traditions in secret. They whispered prayers in Arabic behind closed doors, washed before meals, and fasted during Ramadan while pretending to abstain for other reasons. Like the conversos before them, they were trapped between survival and suspicion, their every gesture scrutinized by watchful neighbors. The Inquisition turned its gaze toward them. Trials accused Moriscos of practicing Islam in disguise. Informants reported the smell of lamb roasted in forbidden ways, or families bathing at unusual hours, or the sound of strange words whispered in prayer. No detail was too small, no suspicion too trivial. Whole communities felt the weight of fear descend. Conversion had not saved them. It had only painted new targets on their backs. Language itself became a crime. Arabic, once the language of philosophy, medicine and poetry in Spain, was outlawed. Books were burned, teachers silenced, children forbidden to learn their ancestors' tongue. Those caught writing in Arabic faced charges of heresy. The loss was immense, centuries of scholarship reduced to ash. With every book that burned, Spain erased a piece of its own past, a past built not only by Christians but also by Muslims who had once made Andalusia the envy of Europe. The pressure boiled into open revolt. In 1499, the Albaycin quarter of Granada erupted in rebellion. Muslims rose against forced conversions and the destruction of their traditions. The uprising was fierce but short-lived. Spanish forces crushed the revolt with brutal efficiency, and thousands were baptized at sword point. Resistance only tightened the crown's resolve. After the Albaycin fell, Ferdinand and Isabella declared that conversion was no longer optional. To remain Muslim in Spain was to live as a criminal. In the years that followed, Moriscos lived double lives. By day they crossed themselves, attended Mass, and spoke in Castilian. By night they whispered Quranic verses, cooked meals in old ways, and passed traditions in secret to their children. The Inquisition hunted them relentlessly, accusing families of clinging to Moorish customs. Fear became constant, fear of betrayal, of a child's careless word, of a neighbour's envy turned into denunciation. For Moriscos, survival was not life but performance. Faith acted under duress. Repression spread beyond Granada, across Valencia, Aragon, and Andalusia. Laws stripped Moriscos of weapons, horses, and even freedom of movement. They were forbidden to wear traditional clothing or play familiar music. Weddings and festivals were monitored, their joy dampened by fear. Communities that had once thrived in vibrant culture became hushed, careful, and brittle. Spain demanded not only faith but identity, reshaping Moriscos into pale reflections of themselves. The repression erupted again in 1568 with the Great Morisco Rebellion in the Alpujarras Mountains. For nearly 2 years, rebels fought desperately against Spanish forces, hoping to preserve what little remained of their heritage. The rebellion ended in rivers of blood. Survivors were scattered across Spain, their communities broken apart deliberately to erase cohesion. The Inquisition followed them, keeping their memory alive not as citizens but as suspects. By the early 17th century, the shadow over Spain's Muslims darkened into finality. In 1609, the Moriscos were expelled, hundreds of thousands forced to leave, echoing the Jewish exile a century before. Spain, in its pursuit of religious purity, cut away yet another thread of its own tapestry. What remained was a kingdom more uniform but poorer, less vibrant, less connected to its past. The shadows that had fallen over the Jews now consumed the Muslims. In trying to save its soul, Spain had lost a piece of it forever. The Spanish Inquisition was born in Castile and Aragon, but it did not stay there. As Spain's empire expanded across seas and into foreign lands, so too did the long shadow of its tribunal. What began as a tool for unifying the peninsula soon became a global instrument of control, shaping colonies and territories as far away as Mexico, Peru, and the Philippines. Wherever Spanish banners flew, the Inquisition's black robes followed, determined to root out heresy in every corner of empire. In Naples and Sicily, Spanish inquisitors established tribunals that echoed the severity of their homeland. Italians accustomed to Rome's authority soon found themselves subject to Spanish standards of conformity. Churches were filled with whispered prayers, while nobles watched carefully not to attract suspicion. The reach of the Inquisition reminded all who lived under Spanish rule that obedience was not optional, no matter how distant the crown. But it was across the Atlantic that the Inquisition gained its widest reach. In Mexico City, Lima and Cartagena, tribunals were established to police the faith of settlers, soldiers, and indigenous converts. The New World was a vast unknown land, filled with cultures, languages, and religions utterly foreign to European eyes. For the Inquisition, it was fertile soil for suspicion. Missionaries baptized entire villages, but inquisitors ensured those baptisms were enforced, watching for any trace of old gods beneath the sign of the cross. The tribunal's presence in the Americas targeted more than native traditions. Settlers themselves often fell under scrutiny. Colonists who skipped mass, questioned doctrine, or mingled too freely with indigenous beliefs found themselves denounced. Even far from Seville or Toledo, the machinery of suspicion turned smoothly. A careless word spoken in a tavern could echo in a courtroom months later. The Inquisition ensured that faith, even on the frontier, remained bound by fear. One of the most infamous roles the Inquisition played in the colonies was policing those accused of sorcery. Indigenous rituals, often misunderstood by Europeans, were branded as witchcraft. Drums, dances, and chants that had once honoured ancient gods now became evidence of heresy. Women in particular were vulnerable, midwives, healers, and storytellers accused of trafficking with demons. Trials unfolded with the same secrecy and dread as in Spain, binding even the farthest reaches of empire to the same terror. Cartagena, a bustling port in present-day Colombia, became notorious for its tribunal. Here the Inquisition policed not only settlers and natives but also enslaved Africans brought across the Atlantic. Torn from their homelands, many clung to ancestral traditions, songs, and spiritual practices. The Inquisitors, blind to their meaning, branded them sorcery or heresy. Thus, Africans joined Jews, Muslims, and indigenous peoples as targets of suspicion. The Inquisition, meant to unify, instead deepened divisions in lands already fractured by conquest. In the Philippines, too, the Inquisition extended its influence. Missionaries baptized entire islands, while inquisitors ensured that native traditions were stamped out. Ancient rituals were condemned, idols destroyed, and shamans silenced. Even in this far-flung corner of empire, Spain's demand for uniformity reached across oceans. Faith, enforced by fire and tribunal, became the thread binding together a realm stretched wider than any before it. The reach of the Inquisition was not only geographic but psychological. Settlers carried fear from Spain into new lands, teaching it to their children. Indigenous converts, caught between two worlds, learned to pray with lips while hiding their old gods in their hearts. Fear crossed oceans as surely as ships did. In distant plazas, under alien skies, the same rituals repeated: the summons, the tribunal, the San Benito, the stake. The empire was vast, but its shadow was one. The Inquisition's presence across the empire also strengthened Spain's power abroad. To outsiders, it signalled that Spanish rule was not just political, but spiritual, a dominion enforced by both sword and sermon. Rival powers painted Spain as cruel and intolerant, while Spain itself embraced the role of Catholic champion. The Inquisition became not only a tribunal, but a banner, a declaration that the Spanish Empire was built on purity of faith no matter the cost. And so, the reach of the Inquisition spread from Iberia to Italy, to Africa, to the Americas, and even to Asia. Its black robes moved as silently as its whispers, binding distant peoples under one iron creed. In Spain, it had crushed diversity. Abroad, it carried the same lesson. Faith was not a choice but a command, and disobedience carried consequences as far as fire could burn. The empire was vast, but its unity rested not on trust or tolerance, but on fear. As the Inquisition tightened its grip across Spain and its empire, its reach expanded beyond Jews and Muslims. Anyone who strayed from the narrow line of orthodoxy could fall under suspicion. Inquisitors cast their nets wide. Protestants, visionaries, mystics, and women accused of witchcraft. Heresy was not limited to bloodlines or ancestry. It lived in words, in dreams, in whispers. To challenge authority, to see visions unsanctioned by Rome, or to heal with herbs instead of sacraments could all be enough to bring the black-robed judges to your door. The Protestant Reformation in the early 16th century sent shockwaves across Europe, and Spain was determined not to let it take root. Books by Luther and Calvin were smuggled into ports, carried by merchants and sailors, spreading ideas of faith without priests, of scripture in the people's tongue. The Inquisition moved swiftly, banning foreign texts, burning contraband, and interrogating anyone suspected of Protestant leanings. Spain prided itself on being the shield of Catholicism, and inquisitors ensured that new ideas were strangled before they could grow. But not all threats came from abroad. Within Spain, mystics and visionaries stirred both devotion and suspicion. Women like Teresa of Avila described visions of Christ so vivid they bordered on scandal. For some, these visions inspired faith. For others, they smelled of heresy. The Inquisition walked a fine line, praising devotion yet distrusting experiences that bypassed priests and sacraments. Those who claimed to hear God directly risked interrogation, their ecstasies treated as dangerous delusions. Women bore the brunt of suspicion. Healers, midwives, and wise women who knew the secrets of herbs were accused of witchcraft. A poultice for fever, a charm for fertility, or a whispered blessing at childbirth could all be twisted into signs of diabolical influence. Accusations often sprang from envy, rivalry, or fear of female power. While Spain's witch trials were fewer than those in Germany or France, the Inquisition still interrogated and punished countless women whose only crime was knowledge. The line between mysticism and heresy blurred dangerously. A vision of Christ's love might be praised, but a claim of receiving new revelations could be condemned. A woman who swooned in ecstasy during prayer might be hailed as holy, or accused of demonic possession. Inquisitors sought control over the unseen world as firmly as they controlled the visible. Dreams, trances, and prophecies were dissected, weighed, and often silenced. The Church permitted no rival voices, even if those voices claimed to speak for God himself. Witchcraft, too, became a theatre of fear. In northern Spain, the Basque country saw waves of accusations, with villagers dragged before tribunals for secret gatherings in the hills. Bonfires blazed with the confessions of witches, confessions often extracted under torture, tales of flying through the night, of feasting with demons, of curses cast on crops and cattle filled inquisitors' records. Whether the accused believed these stories or merely echoed them to end their suffering, the results were the same: punishment, humiliation, and fire. The Inquisition rarely invented fears, it amplified them. Villagers already feared witches who spoiled milk, demons who stalked at night, and visions that could not be explained. The tribunal gave these fears authority, turning superstition into legal crime. A neighbour's curse, a child's sickness, or a storm that ruined crops could all become evidence. In this way, the Inquisition did not just police faith, it policed imagination, shaping what people believed was possible, and punishing those whose lives strayed too far from orthodoxy. Not all accused witches or mystics were destroyed. Some confessed, endured penance, and returned to their communities branded but alive. Others were forced into silence, their knowledge and visions hidden away. Yet their influence lingered, passed quietly to children and grandchildren. The Inquisition could burn books, destroy idols, and silence voices, but it could never fully extinguish the unseen, the dreams, the herbs, the whispered prayers that lived beyond its reach. In some cases, the tribunal's severity backfired. Reports of excessive cruelty or absurd accusations drew criticism even from devout Catholics. Some scholars argued that visions were not heresy but gifts, that herbal cures were part of God's creation. The line between piety and paranoia grew thin, and while the Inquisition rarely relented, its reputation as a merciless force spread wider with each trial. Abroad, Spain's enemies used these stories to paint the nation as fanatical and cruel, feeding the black legend that would haunt its history. The Inquisition's pursuit of heretics, witches, and mystics revealed its deepest truth. It was not only about protecting faith, but about controlling imagination. By policing visions, dreams, and the unseen, it claimed authority not just over bodies but over souls. Spain's mystics still dreamed, its witches still whispered, its heretics still hoped, but always in fear, always in secret. Faith had become a battlefield where silence was survival, and in that silence, the Inquisition thrived. For all its power, the Inquisition was never without its critics. Beneath the silence enforced by fear, voices of resistance stirred, sometimes loud, often quiet, but always present. Scholars, nobles, priests, and common folk questioned the cruelty cloaked in piety. Some dared to speak openly, others whispered in hidden chambers, and many resisted not with swords but with words. Though the Inquisition claimed to police the soul of Spain, there were always those who refused to surrender their conscience. One form of resistance was silence itself. Families of the accused often refused to denounce loved ones, even when threatened with suspicion themselves. Communities sometimes protected neighbours, turning a blind eye to rituals or customs that the Inquisition forbade. In taverns, conversations hushed when inquisitors entered, but once they left, criticism returned in whispers. This quiet refusal to give the tribunal total obedience was a form of defiance, hidden but enduring. Some resistance came from Spain's own clergy. Not all priests agreed with the tribunal's severity. A few argued that conversion by force was hollow, that true faith required freedom. Others criticized the use of torture, warning that confessions wrung from broken bodies were meaningless. These voices were rare and dangerous, for a priest who spoke against the Inquisition risked being branded a heretic himself. Yet their words endured, recorded in letters, sermons, and secret correspondence. Writers and thinkers also pushed back. Humanist scholars, inspired by the Renaissance, argued for reason and tolerance. Figures like Juan de Mariana and Bartolomé de las Casas questioned Spain's brutality, not only in the Inquisition but in the conquest of the New World. Las Casas, in particular, condemned the treatment of indigenous peoples, equating forced conversion with tyranny. His words challenged Spain's image as a holy empire, and though censored, they circulated widely, planting seeds of doubt. In other lands, exiled Jews and Moriscos preserved memories of Spain, not with praise, but with sorrow. They wrote of betrayals, of forced exile, of traditions crushed. These accounts became counter-narratives, shaping how the world saw Spain. The black legend of Spanish cruelty found fuel in these testimonies. Though Spain dismissed them as propaganda, they were powerful weapons, showing that the Inquisition's victims had voices, even if those voices spoke from far away. Within Spain, some resisted through art. Poets wove subtle critiques into verses. Painters embedded quiet defiance into brushstrokes. Mystical writings, while sometimes condemned, also contained coded challenges to orthodoxy, visions that suggested God's love was broader than the tribunal allowed. In monasteries and universities, brave thinkers cloaked their resistance in allegory, ensuring their ideas survived even under the Inquisition's gaze. There were also moments of open protest. Riots broke out when inquisitors pressed too hard, particularly in Aragon and Valencia. Nobles sometimes challenged the tribunal's authority, defending their privileges against the crown's encroachment. These confrontations were rare and risky, but they revealed that the Inquisition's power was not absolute. Beneath the surface of fear, Spain simmered with resentment, waiting for cracks to appear in the tribunal's armour. Some resistance took the form of escape. Families fled to Portugal, France, or across the Mediterranean, slipping past guards and inquisitors to start anew. Others melted into Spain's mountains and rural villages, where inquisitorial reach was weaker. In these remote places, traces of older customs survived, passed down in whispers and rituals that endured in secret for generations. Survival itself was resistance. Even in the colonies, voices of defiance rose. Indigenous peoples resisted forced conversion with hidden worship, blending their gods with Catholic saints. African slaves preserved songs, dances, and rituals, disguising them within Christian forms. Inquisitors tried to stamp out these practices, but they endured, living in the margins where law and faith could not fully reach. These acts of cultural survival were themselves defiance against the uniformity Spain demanded. Resistance did not topple the Inquisition, but it ensured that its power was never total. Whispers, writings, art, protest, escape, each chipped away at the illusion of complete obedience. Spain was bound by fear, but beneath that fear lived courage, creativity, and conscience. The tribunal could silence tongues, but it could not silence thought. In the end, the very fact that voices of resistance endured proved that faith enforced by fire could never truly conquer the human spirit. By the dawn of the 17th century, the Inquisition still loomed over Spain, but cracks were beginning to show. Its fires still burned, its tribunals still summoned, yet the rhythm of history was shifting. Europe was entering a new age of science, discovery, and questioning, and Spain, bound by fear, began to feel the weight of its own rigidity. The Inquisition had silenced dissent, but in doing so, it had also silenced innovation. What once seemed a weapon of unity now began to feel like a chain dragging Spain into decline. The Enlightenment swept across Europe like a fresh wind. In France and England, thinkers championed reason, science, and tolerance. Pamphlets, books, and letters circulated across borders, carrying ideas that questioned authority itself. In Spain, inquisitors tried to dam the flood, banning works of Galileo, Descartes, and Voltaire. But ideas are harder to burn than bodies. Smuggled texts circulated in hidden libraries, and young nobles and scholars read by candlelight, wondering why Spain lagged while its neighbours surged ahead. Economically, Spain suffered. The expulsion of Jews and Moriscos had drained the kingdom of vital skills. Trade faltered, agriculture declined, and the wealth of the Americas was squandered on endless wars. The Inquisition, once a tool of strength, now appeared as a burden. Confiscations and trials disrupted commerce, discouraging investment and progress. Foreigners whispered that Spain was backward, trapped in superstition, while the rest of Europe marched toward modernity. The shadow that had once terrified rivals now invited scorn. Even within Spain, voices grew bolder. Some nobles openly resented the Inquisition's interference with their privileges. Scholars complained that intellectual life was stifled. Writers slipped satire into plays and poems, mocking inquisitors without naming them. Priests, too, began to quietly question whether the tribunal's methods truly served Christ or simply served fear. Though still dangerous, criticism no longer vanished entirely in silence. The tribunal could not control every word, every thought, every heart. The wider world changed as well. Across Europe, witch trials faded, tolerance grew, and even religious wars gave way to uneasy coexistence. Spain, once at the centre of Christendom, now looked out of step. The very practices that once secured its unity appeared barbaric to outsiders. Diplomatic pressure mounted as foreign courts condemned inquisitorial cruelty. The tribunal that once projected Spain's power now embarrassed it, weakening its standing among nations. The Enlightenment brought science, but also skepticism. Spaniards themselves began to question miracles, relics, and even the tribunal's authority. Universities, though tightly monitored, became breeding grounds for cautious inquiry. Medical students dissected bodies despite ecclesiastical frowns. Astronomers peered through telescopes, glimpsing truths that no tribunal could erase. Slowly, the authority of reason chipped away at the authority of fear. By the 18th century, Spain's Bourbon kings saw the Inquisition less as a sacred necessity and more as a political inconvenience. They sought to centralize power, modernize the state, and compete with their European rivals. Though they did not abolish the tribunal outright, they clipped its wings, reducing its independence and influence. Trials continued, but fewer in number, and executions dwindled. The Inquisition was still feared, But its roar was now a growl, loud but no longer dominant. The people too grew weary. Auto da fe that once drew massive crowds now felt archaic, relics of a harsher past. Public interest waned, and attendance dwindled. For many Spaniards, the rituals inspired less fear than fatigue. What had once been theatre for faith now looked like cruelty without purpose. The spectacle that terrified ancestors now embarrassed descendants. Spain was changing, slowly but inexorably. Revolutions abroad shook Spain's old order. The American and French revolutions declared freedom of thought, freedom of conscience, freedom of speech. Spain's colonies stirred with their own desires for liberty. In such a climate, the Inquisition seemed not divine but despotic. Its prisons, its robes, its secrecy, all belonged to a world crumbling before new ideals. The tribunal that once defined Spain's strength now symbolized its refusal to change. By the dawn of the 19th century, the Inquisition was a hollow echo of itself. Its power was weakened, its authority challenged, its very existence questioned. The fires that once lit Spain's plazas now smouldered faintly, more memory than menace. Decline had come not with sudden collapse but with slow erosion, worn away by time, change, and defiance. The Grand Tribunal of Fear was still alive, but its days were numbered, its shadow retreating before the light of a new age. By the early 19th century, the Inquisition was a relic clinging to life in a world that had outgrown it. Revolutions had torn through Europe, kings had fallen, and nations clamoured for liberty. Spain, weakened by war and unrest, faced a growing tide of liberal thought. The Inquisition, once feared and obeyed, now seemed more like a ghost, an old weapon that no longer fit the age. The people who once trembled at its summons now whispered openly of its end. Napoleon's invasion of Spain in 1808 brought foreign armies and new ideas. French troops dismantled inquisitorial offices, freeing prisoners and mocking the rituals of fear. Though temporary, this disruption revealed how fragile the institution had become. When the French withdrew, the Inquisition tried to revive itself, but the spell of terror was broken. Once people saw it could be dismantled, they began to believe it could be abolished entirely. In 1812, Spain's liberal Cortes at Cadiz proclaimed a constitution that limited the tribunal, declaring freedom of the press and ending censorship. Though short-lived, it marked a turning point. Spain's rulers began to see the Inquisition not as protector but as obstacle, an anchor dragging the nation backward. When absolutist monarchs tried to restore its power, they faced fierce opposition. The tide of history had shifted and no royal decree could reverse it for long. By the 1820s, Spain was in turmoil. Colonies in the Americas declared independence, draining wealth and pride from the empire. At home, liberals and conservatives clashed violently, each side demanding a different vision for Spain's future. In this storm, the Inquisition looked increasingly absurd. While Spain bled in battles for survival, the tribunal still tried to police heresy. Burning books while nations burned with revolution, its irrelevance became undeniable. In 1826, one of the last executions for heresy shocked Europe. A schoolteacher named Cayetano Ripoll was hanged in Valencia for teaching deist ideas. Instead of uniting Spain in fear, the act drew ridicule. Foreign nations condemned it, intellectuals mocked it, and Spaniards themselves wondered how their nation could still cling to medieval cruelties. The execution did not strengthen the tribunal, it discredited it further, a final act of folly in a crumbling institution. By the 1830s, Spain's liberals demanded full abolition. The tribunal had shrunk to a shadow, its prisons nearly empty, its auto da fe some memory. Its officials clung desperately to tradition, but even the monarchs saw the futility. Queen Isabella II, only a child when she ascended the throne, ruled under liberal regents who understood that the Inquisition had become a stain on Spain's reputation. In 1834, a royal decree was issued. The Holy Office was abolished once and for all. The abolition was met with relief across Spain. Bells rang, crowds gathered, and newspapers published jubilant editorials. The black-robed inquisitors who once inspired dread now slunk into obscurity, their offices shuttered, their power dissolved. The people who had lived for centuries under fear felt the weight lift, those scars remained. Families still remembered ancestors lost to fire, and entire communities remained absent, erased by exile. But at last the tribunal was gone. Spain stepped uncertainly into a new era. The abolition did not erase superstition, nor did it instantly create tolerance, but it marked a symbolic end to centuries of persecution. The fires that once lit plazas with horror now existed only in memory. The Inquisition, which had shaped Spain's image at home and abroad, was finally consigned to history. In its place grew the slow, uneven struggle toward modernity and freedom. Outside Spain, the abolition confirmed what the world already believed. The Inquisition was the darkest stain on Spanish history. Protestants across Europe rejoiced, scholars praised the progress, and pamphleteers declared it a victory for reason. Spain, once feared as the iron guardian of Catholicism, was now seen as finally yielding to the modern age. Though still politically unstable, its step away from the Inquisition was hailed as a step towards civilization. The Inquisition's abolition did not erase its shadow. Even today the word conjures images of torture, fire, and fear. But in 1834, Spain at last closed the chapter. The tribunal that had defined centuries of faith and persecution was gone, its offices shuttered, its authority broken. What remained were memories, painful, haunting, instructive. The Inquisition's final lesson was not about obedience, but about the danger of power unchecked, and the endurance of those who resisted. With the tribunal gone, Spain was left with its shadow. The Inquisition lived on not in prisons or plazas, but in memory. For centuries, families whispered of ancestors tried, punished, or exiled. Communities remembered vanished neighbours, empty synagogues, and silenced mosques. The institution that once seemed eternal became history, yet its mark lingered. Memory does not vanish with decrees. It lingers in silence, in scars, in the stories told across generations. Beyond Spain, the Inquisition grew into myth. Protestant writers of the 16th and 17th centuries painted it as the ultimate symbol of Catholic cruelty. Pamphlets spread lurid tales of dungeons and devices, some true, others exaggerated. The Black Legend of Spain was born, portraying the nation as uniquely fanatical and tyrannical. Whether accurate or embellished, the legend stuck. Spain's enemies wielded it as propaganda, and even centuries later the word Inquisition conjured images of fire and terror. Artists too carried the memory. Painters depicted grim auto da fe, writers penned novels of forbidden love crushed by fire, and dramatists staged inquisitors as villains cloaked in black. Francisco Goya, Spain's great painter of shadows, captured the cruelty in his etchings, portraying inquisitorial figures as grotesque, absurd, and horrifying. Through art, the memory of fear transformed into symbols of oppression, ensuring the Inquisition would never be forgotten. But memory is never simple. In Spain, some defended the tribunal even after its end, insisting it had preserved unity and saved souls. They argued that cruelty was exaggerated by enemies, that other nations too had burned witches and silenced heretics. For them, the Inquisition was not a shame but a necessity of its time. History is rarely one voice. It is a chorus of contradictions, of guilt and justification intermingled. In the modern world, the word Inquisition became shorthand for any abuse of power, any attempt to police thought or punish belief. Politicians, writers, and revolutionaries invoked it to condemn censorship, tyranny, or fanaticism. The Spanish Inquisition became larger than itself. It became a symbol of fear institutionalized, a warning carved into history of what happens when faith and power merge unchecked. Yet memory was not only shadow. In exile, Sephardic Jews carried Ladino songs, prayers and stories, preserving fragments of the Spain they lost. Morisco descendants remembered recipes, rituals, and words whispered across centuries. These cultural echoes became living resistance, proof that even the most ruthless tribunal could not erase identity. The Inquisition scarred, but it did not destroy. Out of persecution grew resilience, out of silence grew survival. In Spain itself, the ruins of inquisitorial buildings stood as reminders. Old prisons were converted into museums, tribunal halls into archives. Tourists walked the same corridors where prisoners once trembled, gazing at faded San Benitos and yellowed decrees. Memory became history. History became lesson. What was once terror transformed into reflection. Spain, though burdened with the past, also learned to tell its story. Somberly, cautiously, but without forgetting. Globally, the Inquisition became a cautionary tale. In classrooms, it was taught as a warning about intolerance. In novels and films, inquisitors became archetypes of tyranny. Even in humour, the word carried weight, immortalised in satire that mocked its absurdity. What began as a grim institution in 1478 ended as a symbol that transcended time, a shadow used to illuminate the dangers of dogma and fear. The memory of the Inquisition also forced Spain to wrestle with itself. Could a nation built on such cruelty claim greatness? Could its empire, born in fire, be separated from the tribunal that burned its own people? The debates continued through the centuries, with some condemning the Inquisition as Spain's greatest shame, and others insisting it was exaggerated by enemies. Memory became not just history, but identity, shaping how Spain saw itself, and how the world saw Spain. In the end, the Spanish Inquisition endures not in dungeons or decrees, but in memory and myth. It is remembered in whispers of fear, in the silence of lost voices, in the echoes of songs sung in exile. It is remembered in exaggerated pamphlets, in grim paintings, in novels and plays. It is remembered as both truth and legend, warning and weapon, shame and symbol. The tribunal died in 1834, but its shadow remains, etched into history as one of humanity's darkest reminders of how faith, fear, and power can twist together into persecution.